It's not NASCAR, it's not the Monaco Grand Prix, but pigeon racing is racing with a subculture that is callous and cruel, hardly royal and genteel. So why does the Queen of England patronize pigeon racing? Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Pigeon racing often flies under the radar, but in its latest investigation into the so-called sport, PETA has found that all 8 of the Queen of England's birds have died. They were sent to take part in the South African $1 million pigeon race, often called the Olympics of pigeon racing. The Queen is a major patron of all pigeon racing, and now PETA is asking that she end her support. The Queen's birds died in quarantine even before the race began, among the 1,000 who died. In all, 4,000 birds were entered from 36 countries, with only 800 surviving the race. Hannah Schein, Senior Director of Investigations for PETA, believes the numbers only mask the cruelty and signal the urgency to end pigeon racing now. Here's my conversation with Hannah Schein on the PETA Podcast. You know, you do all these investigations. How do you come up with the investigations that you do? You go to bed at night and think, oh, what am I going to look at undercover next time? Or how do you come up with these things?
Well, PETA tries to investigate the industries that use the most animals and cause the most suffering, but we also really try to cover the breadth of animal exploitation and not hit the same topics over and over again. So we really educate people about things they haven't thought about necessarily. So it's always been brought to our attention that pigeon racing kills tremendous numbers of birds. And we started in 2009 looking into it and released our first investigation of pigeon racing in 2010. And from there, we did the U.S. investigation first, exposed the rampant killing of birds, illegal gambling extensively. And we actually ended up getting 3 people charged for commercial gambling, felony commercial gambling in the United States, which was a huge coup, to make a pigeon-related pun. The resulting court case, that those prosecutions were the first time that pigeon racers had been held accountable for illegal conduct in the U.S. So it was a pretty exciting way to start out in investigating this kind of conduct. And so then we investigated pigeon racing in the UK and showed the deadly cross English Channel racing that was going on, from people trucking birds to the continent and then having them have to fly back to the United Kingdom. And then we investigated in pigeon racing in Taiwan. It's interesting, there were some discussion boards, some pigeon forums after our first 2 investigations that said, oh, PETA should really go to Taiwan and see what they're doing out there, but they would never dare. Someone will just throw them off of a ship. And we looked into it, and they actually race pigeons in Taiwan off of cargo ships because it's a smallish island. And in order for all the racers to race their birds equivalent distances, they take these poor birds onto a cargo ship and release them in the middle of the ocean. And so that was a bit of a gauntlet thrown down. So we did investigate pigeon racing in Taiwan. And not to bore you with
no, it's not boring. It's just that I just went into a little thing thinking, oh well, she's going to say, oh, I just thought about this. But this has been a pigeon obsession, really, in a way.
Right. Yeah, it has. Well, when you learn about pigeons, you really grow to respect and love them. And they're amazing birds. They're so smart. They're so loving. They're such amazing mates and parents. And these are exactly the characteristics that make them exploitable by pigeon racers. Their love of home, their love of family, their navigation abilities, their intelligence are exactly what makes them able to come home, even when pigeon racers haul them hundreds of miles away and release them in unknown environments. So it's really twisted. They take their best qualities and exploit them for their amusement, really.
It's really funny because just seeing the coverage you've gotten and seeing the investigation, seeing the video, you do come away with, God, what must it be like to be a pigeon and to be sort of be put into this thing where you're racing at high altitudes and you come back and you can barely walk into your cage. I mean, you can't really see that without feeling something for the birds. And if you feel that something for the birds, you say, why are we allowing for this cruelty to occur? So I think it's very effective that you've done this. And before, I mean, you just listed off this whole range of investigations on pigeons. It's still going on, though. It must, on some level, you're gratified that you've been able to do some things that have made some changes. But on the other hand, it doesn't do away with the whole activity. It still goes on.
Not yet, but we've made some progress. After the Taiwan investigation, we didn't have the highest of hopes for that culture because their animal protection laws aren't as strong as some countries. But we found that the police did systematic raids of pigeon racing clubs after our investigation and put out news releases afterward, crediting PETA with alerting them to these situations. And they busted a number of clubs. They confiscated millions of dollars and also pigeon racing apparatuses, computers, and they ended up charging 242 different people for illegal activity involved in pigeon racing. So that was the most individuals ever convicted after a PETA investigation. So we do feel like maybe that's having a bit of a chilling effect in Taiwan in terms of the gambling, which is the biggest driver of pigeon racing there. And in the U.S., we did see that because the wagering, the illegal gambling was prosecuted in the U.S. races, that many races after that advertised no pooling, and that's their lingo for wagering. So we do see that some of the races did have to change their practices, and one would think that would influence the number of people who send birds to those races if they know they can't engage in the wagering that makes it so fun for some people.
But that's kind of disgusting in a way too, that the exploitation of the birds is acceptable because so people can gamble, and the gambling is the thing. The gambling is the thrill, and the pigeons just sort of get in the way. They just go, well, we're going to exploit them. We're going to harm them. We might as well wager on, which pigeon is Darwinian enough to survive and get back home after we've forced them to go through all the different, pathways. It's kind of sick.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And they treat it like a raffle or a lottery where, you have to breed so many pigeons to just get that one winning ticket who will win a race or win you lots of money and become a lucrative breeder for you so you can sell their babies one after another. So yeah, that all led up to this South Africa investigation, because the South African $1 million pigeon race is one that we'd kept hearing about as like the most lucrative, the most prestigious one-loft pigeon race in the world, which is actually, they call it the Olympic Games of pigeon racing. They have a wide number of countries who send birds to this race. The last one in February was 36 countries had birds at this race. And so we wanted to show what was going on, how are birds being traded at this competition.
And so it's a real subculture you've really dived into here. I mean, starting from 2010 to now, and you're probably practically an expert at this, given all the investigations on pigeons. But, a lot of people who are listening to this would say, oh, just get to the darn investigation, Emil. But before we do, there must be a large number of people who say, they're interested in what's happened or what happens to the animals. But I think need to describe pigeon racing a little bit, because it's not like NASCAR. It's not like people know you go around in an oval or, some other kind of racing, like what they do with horses, which is, pretty abominable too, considering how they're treated. But pigeon racing, I mean, it's got to stop people in their tracks at first to say, yeah, pigeons like the ones we see at the park. How does this thing work, pigeon racing?
Right. So people have bred pigeons for thousands of years to come back to their homes. So these are homing pigeons. They're a little bit different than some other domestic pigeons that have been bred to look fancy or tumble in the air. There's all different kinds of pigeons. But so homing pigeons, people use them historically to send messages back and forth, or to or just purely for sport. So right now, what people do for pigeon racing, there's two kinds. There's racing where you take your birds to a central location, they're trucked away, and they're all raced back to your different homes, and the birds have a chip on a band around their leg. And that chip, when it passes a sensor as they're entering the building that you've built for them, the loft, it records in a clock. And then the racers bring their clocks to their club, and the results are tabulated. And then there's something else called one loft racing. Now that's the bigger money. That's where participants from a wider area, sometimes international, will send their birds to one destination. Often it's someplace where people would want to go on vacation, so that people will come in person to actually see the final race and make their wagers in person. And so you find these in across the U.S. and across the world, and South Africa and Thailand. The Canary Islands have all kinds of one loft races. And that's where the birds are sent as babies. Just after they're weaned, they leave the nest and they're shipped off so that they home to this new loft. They then consider that their home. And they're all trained on progressively longer training tosses and preliminary races, and then it culminates in the main race. So all the birds are trucked to a single location, and then they fly back to that one loft, and that's why it's called a one loft race.
So it's all about getting home. There's a kind of
It's all about getting home at the highest rate of speed. And for these one loft races, because especially in the South Africa race, they train them almost every day. So it's very taxing on the birds. And in this situation, they're not segregating birds who maybe don't arrive back the same day of the training or the race. They're just, the birds come in, and then if there's another race 2 hours later, they all get sent out for that training or that race. So they consider this, a test of the quality of the birds. And there's not really a lot of sentiment or sympathy for birds who don't make the grade. The idea is to winnow them down so that only a few people win the big prizes. And that wouldn't happen if you were less hard on the birds, unfortunately.
So it's a major test of endurance. Many birds die in the process.
Yeah. In the South Africa race, not only is it a test of endurance, but many, many thousands of birds historically have died at that race before even starting training. When you have birds coming in from many different countries, they keep them for about a month in a quarantine situation where they're not leaving the loft. And in this current edition of the race, out of over 5,000 birds who were entered, about 1,200, the race manager told us, died just in quarantine alone, including all 8 of the birds sent by the Queen of England.
And that really is the beginning of the investigation. It was in England, and you're linking up the Queen to this sport. Is this a royal sport if the Queen's involved? The Queen of England.
Yeah, I mean, she's a patron of many UK pigeon racing organizations, and she maintains a royal loft in Sandringham, which is an estate that she owns. And she has about 200 pigeons there. They breed them constantly, and they send them to both races in the UK, races that fly from France to the UK, and this race in South Africa. And they're also entered in another long distance marathon race, which is very deadly, called the Barcelona International Race. And that one is, I think, 750 miles back to the loft after crossing Spain, France, and the English Channel. So, yes, she's unfortunately supporting these deadly races, and we've asked her to please stop doing that and to turn her pigeon loft, instead of a breeding mill like most pigeon racers' lofts, just to turn it into a sanctuary, to turn it into some kind of haven for injured or found or unwanted racing pigeons.
Now, before PETA's investigation, has anyone ever gone to the Queen and asked her to stop participating in this blood sport? I mean, has anyone ever, gone up to her and said, look at what this sport is about, you should stop it?
I don't think so. There's this myth that pigeon racing is a quaint, harmless pastime, when in fact these competitions are massacres masquerading as sport. They're blood sports, and it's, they paint this picture of how they cherish the birds and how the birds come home because the love of the loft, but really they know that they're breeding, into the Queen's case, about 80 birds a year, and sending them out to races, knowing very well that most of them will not come back. So it's disingenuous to claim that you love birds and yet put them into that peril.
It's kind of like a suicide mission, huh?
Absolutely, but it's a numbers game. So they know that they have to breed 100 young birds a year in order to have 30 of them by the next year, and then a few left after that to keep as future breeders. If pigeon racers got back all 100 birds every year, can you imagine how large their lofts would have to be to accommodate that?
So it's a way of winnowing the herd in a way?
Absolutely. And over again, our investigators are told that if you want to be a top pigeon fancier, which is what they call themselves, that you have to be ruthless in selecting only the best birds, only the best bloodlines, only the most successful racers. And if you don't, you're just going to be breeding rubbish, as they call it. And then you'll never be a top pigeon racer. So over and over again, when we've asked pigeon racers the secret to their success, they say it's by selecting the best birds, or they even use the word culling, which they sometimes claim is just another synonym for selecting, but really what it means is killing. So if you don't keep many birds, then you're essentially either losing them in races, in which they die, or you're killing them. And when you peel back the curtain, when you pull that back and you get them to really admit what they do, most of them say that they break their necks. We had one pigeon racer tell us in the US that he squeezes their breasts so they can't breathe. We've had people say they drown them. Occasionally people will say that they're too soft to kill them themselves, so they'll give them to a live market. But generally, the main way that pigeon racers get rid of birds that they don't find fit enough or lucrative enough is they break their necks.
You have a video in the investigation, and people can see it at PETA.org, where they have these bags. And the guy talks about it very matter-of-factly. I suppose you had an undercover camera as the guy's describing it, because he's very nonchalant about actually killing a bird right, before the camera.
Yeah, we did have undercover cameras, but that person actually let us stick our camcorders right in that feed bag that he was using to keep the blood off his clothes and property. So that was one case where, covert cameras weren't even the sole means of recording, shockingly. And so we were able to show the standard practice of how birds are pretty callously killed for pigeon racing.
So when you did the undercover story in England, and you got the Queen's trainer, and you showed how she has 8 birds. She's got some really prized breeding pigeons that she houses there. Is that it?
Sure. Well, part of the prestige of being the queen is that even if your birds aren't the best racing birds, people still want them. They still want the novelty of having a bird that has the queen's name on his leg or her leg. So we attended this auction, which is the biggest pigeon show of the year in England, and showed that the 2 birds being sold by the Queen's Loft, who happened to be a male and a female, were bought by a single person who intended to breed them as a novelty and have them in his loft. And he said, they'll die here. They'll never leave here because, as you know, if a pigeon is homed to a certain loft and you bring them somewhere else, you sell them to another flyer, that flyer can't let them out, or else they'll just go back to their home. So they're called prisoners, these birds, and then they're just used for breeding. And depending on the breeder, they might just serially breed them over and over and over. In fact, these birds were purchased in late January. By the end of March, they'd already produced 4 babies for this guy. So,
were they good racers?
I think they were just actually young birds who'd probably never even raced. They were just bred by the loft and sold at this auction. And it's more that this flyer wanted the novelty of having Queen's birds in his collection.
So if you have a Queen's bird, that's considered status. They're not necessarily good racers. And what did the investigation find in terms of the Queen's birds? I know that you ultimately get to the South Africa race, but what did you find about what happens to her birds and the people who care for them or don't care for them, really?
Right. So she had sent 8 birds to the South Africa race this year. And when we say for the 2020 race, they were shipped in 2019, but they did not, I think 2 died each week of the 4-week quarantine. And so all 8 were dead, according to Paul Smith, who is the UK coordinator who transports all the birds from the UK to the South Africa race. And he jokes about it, again, so callously joking that he called the Queen to let her know that all her birds are gone. And he said, well, there's my knighthood gone. And he made that joke several times, actually, about his knighthood. Not
would the Queen even knight him if he were successful, or is that is a kind of a joke, I guess?
Just a joke, just saying that he had bad news to deliver to her, but it's not new. It's not. In the last 6 years, we analyzed the records for this race, and of the 42 birds she sent over those 6 years, only 5 survived till the end of the race. So it's not unusual for her to lose birds at this competition.
So the callousness of this all, and considering the gentility of the Queen and how England and UK is generally more animal rightsy than you would expect. I mean, it's got to be shocking that when you broke this investigation in England, there was some hue and cry. People that someone, this PETA, is urging the Queen to end pigeon race cruelty. I mean, that was big news in England.
It was. There was a good wave of press. It was broken by the Times, covered by the Express, and on the front page of the Daily Star. So it did make a splash. And
all the different classes, all the people. I mean, you went the tabloids to the high end. It was
right. It made the spectrum of UK journalism. And now, just this week, there's a new wave of press coming out of South Africa, where it just made it on the investigative news magazine Noseweek, and so the press is now picking up in South Africa, and we hope that continues. But yeah, you would think that the Queen would want to avoid unsavory associations, but that's just what we keep finding whenever we investigate pigeon racing, is the seedy underbelly, the deeply unsavory, behind the scenes goings on at these races. And at the South Africa race, I mean, it's a litany of illegality that we found. It's just miraculous. Like, we have submitted complaints. We have a crackerjack lawyer who wrote these amazing complaints about the illegalities. One complaint was about invasive species and violations of the environmental laws in South Africa, because pigeons are considered a non-native species there. They're considered invasive. And this racing organization does not appear to have any permits for importing pigeons and keeping them in South Africa. So he drafted this really detailed complaint about that. He also submitted a complaint about the rampant illegal gambling that we found there. And a third complaint went over all the financial shenanigans that our investigator was told about quite openly by some of these pigeon racers. And some of the things they were admitting to was how to use pigeon racing for tax evasion, money laundering, currency exchange control, where, South Africa has rules for how much money you can move out of the country. So they were explaining that the pigeon trade is, quote, better than diamonds for being able to move money between countries without government oversight.
So was this organized crime, or just a bunch of fanciers or enthusiasts who were rich and needed some money to launder, and had stumbled into this great unregulated thing called pigeon racing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a really ripe, unregulated industry that's apparently an easy avenue for people with money to be able to move it back and forth by selling birds, trading birds, claiming that the bird died. And that, they actually gave our investigators such detailed examples that when I read the legal complaint, I was blown away by how compelling it was. And I really think the authorities are going to be, they're going to really have a lot to dig their teeth into.
Now, you're talking about South Africa, but no doubt there must be some kind of mirror thing going on in the UK. Are they looking into the same kind of thing, or does it get kind of whitewashed in a way because of the Queen? The Queen's involvement?
Well, in the UK, we found that they actually do allow gambling on pigeon racing. The UK is very liberal about gambling on most things. You can walk into just street storefronts and gamble on pretty much anything from sports to politics.
Right. Anything. Right. Exactly.
Right. Anything.
What color Trump's hair is this week? Here.
Yeah, exactly. So that wasn't really going to be a fruitful avenue for us in the UK. But we certainly appeal to the Queen, and we've appealed to government agencies there about the issue of birds traveling over country lines in terms of spreading disease. Like, I mean, pigeons are wonderful, but they can carry disease. They can become infected with bird flu, Newcastle disease, and they have diseases that are zoonotic that can actually affect people's health regardless of whether they are symptomatic or not. And the other diseases that I just mentioned, like Newcastle and bird flu, have billion-dollar implications for the poultry industries, the birds who are in factory farming settings. So it's something that we have definitely submitted complaints to UK officials about. And, we'll use any kind of legal leverage we can to try to get these kind of races stopped, because they're bad for pigeons and they're bad for people.
Well, it sounds like it's such an unregulated thing. I mean, on the one hand, you're saying in South Africa, it's sort of the Wild West, but, gambling is legal in the UK. But, but gambling aside, just in terms of the cruelty, there should be something to protect the welfare of the animals. And is there anything that is strong enough to go to these fanciers, these pigeon fanciers, and say, hey, let's keep in mind standards of animal cruelty or animal welfare?
I wish it were illegal on those grounds, but officials that we've approached about cruelty to animals charges, they need to see dead bodies, essentially. They need to see that animals have been harmed. And when you have a typical pigeon race where you send out 1,000 birds and 200 come home, where's the proof of suffering and death? Very often, you don't know what happened to those birds. You just know that they are most likely dead. Domesticated, pigeons, they're given food, they're given water. They don't get taught the skills from their families how to find food and water in the wild. So most pigeon races are intended to be completed in one day without the birds staying out overnight, which becomes much more dangerous for them, trying to find food and water, trying to avoid predators. And to us, sending hundreds or thousands of pigeons out hundreds of miles from their home and abandoning them, it's like taking that many dogs or chickens or any other animal away from their homes and abandoning them. It should be considered cruelty. But because pigeons have this homing ability and there's this tradition of using them for sport, they somehow get a free pass.
And yet, when you say 1,000 get let out, 200 come back, those 800 that are presumed dead, I mean, they're not like off somewhere flying to some southern, landscape to enjoy their life in the sun. They're usually don't, like you said, they don't know how to, fend for themselves, get food and water. Mm-hmm. Even those that survive the race are like practically gasping to get back into the loft because they're dehydrated. Yes. They don't have water. I mean, you have a tremendous bit of footage that shows how some birds are after they finish the race. So, I mean, yes. Isn't that proof though, if 800 don't come back, that this is not sport, that this is not something that is pro-animal in any way?
Absolutely. It's not pro-animal. And as you saw in the video where some of the birds land and they can't even walk, they just face plant on the concrete. These birds that were released for the South Africa race, the final race, they had to fly 373 miles. That was the longest they'd ever flown. It was extremely hot. It was in the mid-90s where they were flying in Fahrenheit. They were at a high altitude. And in terms of the ground level, I think it was 1,600 meters, which is about a mile high. So it's like flying and if you were suddenly, transported to Denver and had to exercise. And they're flying over desert. And the birds were let out, I think, 6 a.m. from the truck. And only 3 made it back by nightfall. And the rest of them had to somehow find their way back. And out of 1,500 plus birds who were sent out for that final race, there were only 704 who made it back within 7 weeks. These stats are from 7 weeks after the race when they finally stopped counting.
See, for normal people, when they hear that, they've got to be somewhat appalled, but to the pigeon fancier and to that whole subcult, it's like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. That's got to be shocking.
Yeah. And they tout, I had a bird who was 33rd in the race or by my babies because their father was 11th in the race. They tout that as the harder the race, the more interesting it is for them when they're selling the offspring of those successful birds.
And how much, if you wanted to buy a bird, like a queen's bird or a successful bird, Do the breeders get thousands, or is it?
They can. Yeah. The winner of the 2020 race sold for, I think, $118,000 this year. So that's a pretty big payoff, not counting the fact that the winner won $150,000 in prize money, plus any winnings that if the racer gambled on their bird. And some people make over $300,000 from a race like that.
So this is eye-opening to people who are for animal rights, animal welfare. They feel, people who are empathetic toward animals. What can be done? I mean, you've made an appeal with your investigation to the Queen of England to end pigeon race cruelty. But what does the Queen say?
Right now, they're not saying anything. They just say that they comply with all rules and regulations in the UK. But we are asking people who feel that this should stop to sign our petition at PETA.org. Actually, we have the main petition on the UK PETA site. And we also have action alerts still posted about Taiwan pigeon racing if people want to take action on that as well, asking that Taiwan stop its ocean racing, which is exceptionally cruel. And it's hard. It's one of those things where it's not easy to boycott as a consumer this kind of industry because it's not dependent on the public support.
It just goes on underneath our noses, really. I mean, it's this subculture, and I know they probably can just say, well, if they got rid of the worst things, it's still just a bunch of guys with birds, right? Doing their thing. Well, do women do this? Are there women pigeon racers, pigeon fanciers?
There are. It's definitely more men than women, but there are some women who are the primary flyers in their family who enter birds under their name. But it's very, very much more dominated by males, and it does cross all socioeconomic strata. And it's in the U.S. at least, it can be actually larger among more recent immigrants than not. So you get a wide cross section of national origins involved in the sport.
But what do they get out of it, though? What do the people who are pigeon racers, when they know what's happening to their animals? I mean, they can't love the animals if they know that the animals can die or the animals are subjected to these really extreme conditions that could mean death. What do they get out of it, the pigeon fanciers?
It's hard to say. Some people do like keeping pigeons, and they have, I think in their own heads, they think they love pigeons. There must be some cognitive dissonance there because they are putting the pigeons in harm's way, and they know they're not getting all their pigeons home, and they rely on that, or else they wouldn't be able to breed so many, and they would have nowhere to put them. But there, on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who don't claim to even love pigeons who are also very much involved in bird hunting, and they keep pigeons as a way of also having birds to train their hunting dogs with. So I've seen plenty of that kind of discussion on websites. And, some people do it for bragging rights. Some people do it just because they grew up doing it and they have fond family associations with pigeon racing. But other people do it for money, for profit.
And I suppose the Queen's endorsement of it is a big thing. If she were to say tomorrow, let's end pigeon racing, I'm sorry for what I've done to my family and also to the pigeons, and I'm going to get rid of pigeon racing, would it, or I'm going to pull out, I'm going to be the Queen, I'm going to pull out of pigeon racing, would it have an impact?
I would think it would have an impact, at least in the UK, and maybe open people's eyes to the fact that it is such a slaughter. And, some people excuse it by saying, well, the birds are eaten by hawks, or it's a kind of a natural selection kind of thing. But you're breeding the pigeons and putting them out there to be killed. It's not natural for your birds to be killed by hawks if they wouldn't exist were it not for your breeding mill. So
it's almost as if just like the rats in a laboratory, the rats and the mice in the laboratory, and people say, "Oh, we don't care about lab rats or lab mice," and they don't consider those as significant lives. When you get to the numbers in pigeon racing, is it that same thing too? That, well, we just don't consider these lives worthy enough, the pigeons?
Probably. I mean, people see what pigeon racers call common pigeons that you see on buildings and in parks, and probably think, what's the difference? There's plenty of pigeons out there. It's not like they're endangered. I've heard those exact sentiments before. But we wouldn't do this to other animals. We wouldn't do this to puppies. We wouldn't do this to horses. So I think if people got to know pigeons better and their really wonderful qualities, they would be more sympathetic and more ashamed of what is done to pigeons.
Well, Hannah Schein, I have to say that I didn't realize this wasn't your first rodeo in terms of the pigeons, and that you went back and had this litany of investigations going back to 2010. Here we are 10 years later, and the sport is still thriving. But I think if people see this investigation, and if maybe you get the Queen to see the cruelty, I think you're making some real headway, and I congratulate you on this investigation.
Thanks, Emil.
And I hope that people see the investigation at PETA.org. Thank you for enlightening us on pigeons. I grew up, I used to think pigeons were only in San Francisco where I grew up, and there were like a ton of pigeons all over the city, but they're everywhere, right? They're like a common bird, right? I mean,
they are. They're a bird that everyone could probably look out their window and admire. But I do think if people took a little time to read up on pigeons, they would appreciate them even more.
What's the one thing, if you could tell the Queen about the special quality or the special nature of pigeons that makes this whole thing about the cruelty to pigeons so, just unimaginable, because these are living, breathing beings? What would you tell her?
There's so many standout qualities of pigeons, but because the royal family is known for family dedication, I would emphasize the pigeons' dedication to family. They're excellent parents. Both of the pigeons, the father and the mother, make milk in their crops for each of their two babies. So they have two babies at a time. They each take turns sitting on the nest each day. So they're exemplary parents. They're dedicated to each other. If they had their choice, they'd mate for life. And I think that kind of family dedication would resonate with someone who's kind of known for her own dedication to family, the Queen.
Hannah Schein, thank you very much. I appreciate your investigations that you do, and they're all done. I got to think they're kind of dangerous too, with the kind of underbelly that's associated with pigeon racing. So I appreciate your courage and your willingness to get out there and to. Thank you.
This one, my boots were not on the ground in South Africa. So my shout out to the person who did the legwork there. It can be a scary thing.
Well, it's an eye-opening investigation, and I hope people understand what's going on right under our noses, the cruelty to pigeons and this thing they call pigeon racing. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Emil.
Hannah Schein, Senior Director of Investigations for PETA. See the latest investigation of PETA involving the Queen of England and the South African $1 million pigeon race at PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund blog. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Oh, and one more way to get in touch with me. See more of what I do at AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about, or just check it out wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.